She stepped off the train in her sister's dress, uninvited, unwanted, and already judged. "I wrote to Margaret," the cowboy said, turning his back without another word. By sundown, she was sleeping in a barn, the lace sleeves soaked with tears. But what happened next will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. The air in Dry Valley was drier than Evelyn expected, thin and scratchy, like disappointment breathed into dust. The sun was just settling behind the ridgeline, casting long shadows that made the town seem older, more suspicious. Her boots clicked softly on the wooden platform, the only sound brave enough to accompany her arrival. In her hand, the envelope felt heavier than it had on the train. Jackson Wade's handwriting stared back at her like an accusation. He had written to Margaret. Margaret with the lilting voice, the soft curls, the figure that made dressmakers sigh with satisfaction. Evelyn, on the other hand, had always carried herself like someone apologizing for taking up space. The station master glanced up from his ledger and blinked at her, clearly expecting someone else. That was the trouble with stepping into another woman's future. It never quite fit right, no matter how carefully you fastened the buttons. She descended the platform stairs slowly, her skirt catching in the wind, revealing worn shoes dyed to match a borrowed dress. The hem was too short. Margaret had always been more delicate. Evelyn spotted him immediately. Jackson Wade was impossible to miss. Broad-shouldered, bronzed by work and war, the kind of man whose stillness filled the space around him. He looked like someone who'd built his life board by board, brick by brick. He held a photograph in one hand and the edge of his hat with the other. When she approached, his eyes moved to her face with the dull click of disappointment locking into place. His words, "I wrote to Margaret," struck not with anger, but something worse, the cool finality of closed gates. There was no outburst, no shout, just a silence that said everything. "You're not what I asked for." Evelyn did not plead. She didn't know how. Pride was the one thing poverty and rejection hadn't managed to take from her. "Margaret's not coming," she said, her voice breaking on the edges like an old cup. I had no place else." He turned, walked away. That was when she felt it. The eyes, judging, measuring. Some narrowed in pity, others curved with glee. In small towns like Dry Valley, news didn't travel, it breathed, and Evelyn was fresh gossip. She spent the night in the livery barn, beneath the smell of horse sweat and hay rot. Her sister's dress, now rumpled and smeared with sawdust, clung to her like a cruel joke. Evelyn curled around her carpetbag and listened to the wind rattle the boards. Somewhere outside, a coyote cried. But inside, she stayed silent. Because Margaret had run off with love and Evelyn had arrived in her place, only to learn she was never meant to belong. The snow came early to Dry Valley that year, blanketing the crooked roofs and muddy streets in a hush that made every word carry twice as far. Evelyn learned quickly how to walk without drawing attention, shoulders low, footsteps soft, gaze always fixed on the hem of her dress. But in a town this small, invisibility was a fantasy no one could afford. Everyone saw her, and worse, everyone remembered she wasn't the one he wrote to. The upstairs room above the bakery smelled of burnt sugar and yeast, and Evelyn was grateful for it. The landlady, Mrs. Cleary, had a heart wrapped in thin cotton and scolded with a gentleness that made Evelyn ache. In return for the room and 2 half meals a day, Evelyn scrubbed pans until her knuckles bled, stitched aprons until her fingertips were numb, and kept her mouth shut. Silence, she'd learned, was the only defense that didn't need to be mended later. Still, silence didn't stop the stories. The wives at the general store said she'd come to trap Jackson Wade, pretending to be her sister to gain a ranch and a husband. The men muttered over poker and whiskey that Jackson had been duped by a plain girl with a plan. Even the children whispered as they passed, eyes wide with inherited suspicion. Evelyn absorbed it all like frost on bare skin, chilling, but survivable. She never corrected them, never explained. There were no letters home, no confessions, no pleas for Margaret to come fix what she'd broken. Evelyn had stepped into the fire, and she would not cry for rain. Instead, she kept busy. She helped the pastor's wife carry chopped wood to the rectory, her fingers blistered from the cold. She made tiny mittens for a crippled boy who never smiled, and left crusts of her own bread for the birds that lingered around the bakery roof, too hungry or stubborn to migrate. And Jackson watched. He never meant to, not consciously, but his eyes found her even when he didn't realize it. At the well, lifting buckets with quiet strength, or kneeling in the snow to bandage a stray dog's paw. She didn't act like someone plotting. She acted like someone surviving. Then one afternoon, beneath a sky the color of raw steel, he saw her shrug off her only shawl and wrap it around an old woman who'd slipped near the post office. Evelyn's lips were blue, her arms bare to the wind, but her expression remained unchanged, steady, unflinching, almost serene. And something in Jackson shifted, like ice groaning before a thaw. It wasn't pity. It was recognition, not of someone trying to take her sister's place, but of someone trying to rebuild her own. By the time spring unclenched its icy grip from Dry Valley, the town shook itself awake with slow rituals, the turning of soil, the scrubbing of porches, and the hanging of linens that hadn't seen wind since October. But more than any of that, the townsfolk looked forward to the quilting bee. It was less a craft than a ceremony. Women gathered in the church hall with calloused fingers and quiet rivalries, each hoping their square would be the one remembered. Threads were drawn like battle lines, stitches carried pride, and gossip was served in the pauses between patterns. Evelyn arrived without fanfare, her blanket folded in her arms like something sacred. She walked past the rows of pies and preserves, past the knot of women in matching aprons, and found a spot near the window, sunlight warming the edge of the fabric. She didn't speak, just unfolded the quilt like a confession laid bare. It wasn't the prettiest on the table. The colors were mismatched, the edges uneven, the thread frayed in places, but it held a strange gravity. One woman murmured, "That looks like feed sack cotton," eyeing a square of faded blue. "It is," Evelyn replied. "From my father's work shirt. The pink calico was Mama's house dress. The embroidery came off a handkerchief Margaret gave me when I left home." The room stilled, not out of awe, but uncertainty. The quilt wasn't elegant. It was honest. A living record of people now gone, of a life too plain to boast, but too proud to apologize. Whispers spread like dye in water. "She brought memories to a quilting bee?" One woman scoffed. "What's she proving?" That's when Jackson stepped through the back door, brushing dust from his sleeves. He hadn't meant to come, not really, but he'd heard. And when he saw the blanket, he didn't look at its flaws. He touched the hem as if it might tell him something no one else had dared to hear. "This yours?" he asked. Evelyn nodded once. "Yes?" His fingers paused on a square stitched with uneven stars. "It's honest work." A scoff rippled behind him. "Not like how she got here." Jackson turned, slow and sure. "You know what I see?" His voice didn't rise, but it cut through the murmurs like a nail through silk. "I see a woman who stitched her life back together with less help than most of you would need to sew a button." No one answered. No one dared. That evening, as the sun dipped low over Dry Valley, Jackson knocked on Evelyn's door with 2 chipped mugs of coffee and no pretense. "You didn't take your sister's place," he said. "You made one of your own." And Evelyn, for the first time since she stepped off that train, let herself breathe like someone who might finally stay. The night of the spring dance unfolded with the slowness of memory. Soft air, lanterns swinging in the breeze, and fiddle music leaking through the gaps in the town hall's crooked shutters. It had rained earlier, just enough to lay the dust and awaken the scent of lilacs. Couples arrived in pairs, laughter and perfume preceding them, but Evelyn lingered in the shadows near the churchyard fence, unsure if she belonged to the evening at all. The blue dress she wore was stitched from leftover fabric and patience. It had taken her 3 weeks, one evening seam at a time, to coax it into shape. It had no lace, no ribbons, no fanciful trim, just clean lines, a careful hem, and sleeves that brushed her wrists like a remembered kindness. She'd almost stayed home. But as she swept the bakery floor earlier that day, the baker's daughter, no more than 10, looked up from rolling dough and whispered, "Mr. Wade's been watching the door." So Evelyn came. Inside, the hall flickered with lamplight and murmurs. She stood at the threshold like someone reading a story she didn't think she was in. The music dipped, paused, then began again, slow and reverent, a waltz meant for promises. Jackson was already moving before she knew he'd seen her. He didn't hesitate, didn't ask. He simply crossed the distance between them with 3 sure strides, as if every step since the day she arrived had been leading to this one. He held out his hand. She placed hers in it. No words passed. He led her to the center of the room, and when his arm circled her waist, it was not possessive. It was steadying, anchoring. They moved together, her plain blue dress brushing the edges of borrowed gowns, his boots silent against the floorboards. The chatter hushed. Heads turned. Then someone clapped. One clap, tentative. Then another. Then a rising applause like rain on a roof, soft and unexpected. "Folks say you weren't the right sister," he murmured, so low only she could hear. "I say they sent the wrong letter, but God made sure the right woman came." Her breath hitched, not because of the words, but because of the truth in them, the way they reached deeper than kindness, deeper than rescue. Later, beneath lanterns that flickered like fireflies, he looked at her, not like a man who'd changed his mind, but like one who'd finally found the answer. "I asked for a promise," he said. "You gave me a life." And Evelyn, whose life had been stitched together from hand-me-downs and hushes, smiled through tears, not from sorrow, not from surprise, but from the astonishing grace of being truly seen.